Welcome back to Care Beyond Code, the show from VBA where we talk all about the strategies and decisions injecting a little more humanity into the healthcare experience, making it better for everyone. Today, my guest is Jerame Dellapenta, the Director of Service Delivery and Engagement for Nova Healthcare. Jerame, thanks so much for joining me.
No, my pleasure. Glad to be here.
Let's jump right into this story. Now, folks who have watched and or listened to Care Beyond Code before, you know that we've covered a range of stories so far, from things as simple as a misspelling at the counter at the pharmacy, all the way up to serious health scares that, thanks to the administrative process, actually were helped rather than burdened or slowed. And today we're going to talk about a patient and a potential diagnosis, which has become all the more prevalent in society over the last 20 to 50 years. And that is the spectrum. Autism spectrum diagnosis has become much more prevalent, certainly much more talked about. And in fact, that's the center of today's case, because sometimes it needs to be escalated in the administrative process to be taken care of properly, because the prevalence has accelerated, perhaps beyond what folks are prepared or otherwise flexible enough to handle right in the moment, but urgent for those to whom it impacts. Jerame, can you tell us a little bit more about the story, this patient, and why this story was escalated at all?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We had an enrollee that, as the story goes, she has a dependent, a son, who was in a situation where they actually felt there was something that may have been, in their own words, off when he was rather young. And so through a series of different events and really speaking to a bunch of different people, they ended up getting what they thought was a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder early on in their growth period. So what they did with that, they weren't really even sure, because the child was at such a young age, it really didn't affect anything as far as what they thought would be needed for education or support. And quite frankly, at that point, you don't know who to talk to or who to turn to. So at that time, they started to move forward with what they thought they would have to do. They did research online and things along those lines, but it got to a point where now we're into early developmental periods. So now we're starting to age a little bit. They realize they're going to need some additional help, whether that's respite, whether that's going to be help, as far as PTSD, OT, all of those things that could play a role. And in addition, they thought they would also need some help as it relates to the OPWDD, which, is different, depending on the states, but ultimately wanted to get to that place where they might be able to get some financial assistance. Really not knowing where to go. And again, we find circumstantially that it seems that it feels that when you're on the other side of that, it feels like you don't have anyone that's an advocate for you. You don't have the support. Everyone has a little bit different idea of what's going on. And sometimes one area or one resource will point to another area and they point back, and you just feel like you're caught in the middle. So this particular individual was in a situation where they found through the process that because the child was, and I'll say it this way, was diagnosed at an early age, it wasn't with allegedly the proper testing or the neurodevelopmental tests that you would typically have 5 to 10 years later. So what they were trying to do was get that testing done ultimately, and initially thought, well, we have health insurance that should be covered, right? So what they called initially, and they were told, unfortunately, these tests, as far as we knew, were not going to be covered. It wasn't part of the overall benefit. In fact, in most cases, if you look them up, they are still considered experimental in a way, right, wrong, or different. That is ultimately how they're coming up, as experimental and not necessarily treating anything. So they don't typically get covered, so to speak, through the insurance. So there was some question at that point. This is probably somewhere around the first or second call. Is there any option for us to try to get something pre-approved? And what had been offered is sort of a pre-authorization of sorts, if they would be able to send in information, some form of medical information through their medical practitioner, in this case, their psychiatrist, that would try to outline some information that would get them to a place where maybe these tests can be done. And so their psychiatrist took the information, they did send it in, and unfortunately, after review, with this pretty much exactly what I told you, it got to a place where they went, I'm sorry, this is just not something we're going to cover. We'll cover the initial consult, but we're not going to cover any of the testing that occurred. or
How
that was
come
going
a
to
test
occur.
from 5, 10 years ago wasn't valid to like suggest that an updated test is necessary? And I'm not exactly
Sure.
sure of the ins and outs of all of this. I personally, I do have
Yeah.
a child who gets aid from the state as well, therapy wise. But the gap in timing is interesting to me because
Yeah.
it's not like that goes away.
Yeah. There was the test. If I am, thinking back some months ago, I think they came back with a diagnosis of stereotypic movement disorder. So it wasn't a full blown diagnosis of ASD. And I guess the model had changed at one point where like the elite version of the test wasn't given at that time. This was more of an overview based on some interaction between objects, things along those lines that led to this stereotypic movement disorder and not a full blown diagnosis.
Got it.
They correlated at the time, the counselor at the time had correlated this to being on the spectrum. So I think from a default perspective, the parents were like, well, we got this autism diagnosis, so we can move forward with what we have. When it was reviewed, ultimately that wasn't the case. And they suggested this other test, which unfortunately the name escapes me. But this other test, which was a little bit more comprehensive, a little bit more involved in over stages, and the cost was relatively expensive. It got to a point where and cost to some people may not be a big thing where cost to other people is. And this clearly the cost was something that was very devastating to them. This was something that they just knew they weren't going to be able to afford to even get to the next step of being able to request any kind of financial assistance, any kind of services, whether that's older as they might need someone to sit side by side from a work perspective, like someone that could be like a work coach, or any kind of funding as it relates to respite services or things like that. So they felt, and I say this coming from experience in the sense that I talked to this member after that and they poured out on this call. I felt it. I felt it, and for complete transparency, this parallels some things that I had later in my life with my own child who is also on the spectrum, where we felt the same thing. Like we felt in the middle, we felt like we couldn't get help and didn't know where to turn. And so where I didn't experience what they did at the time that they did, it gave me some insight to what I knew was going to probably happen in the future. And now looking back, I can fill in some of those gaps. But all that to say, I wanted to do something. We tried to do something. So what we did from that point forward is actually in speaking to a couple of people internally, including even the client services individual for the group, we tried to come up with anything that we could do that might be like maybe an out of plan authorization, something that's typically not covered. And there's things that go along with that, that implicate leaving a plan design and things like that. And we ultimately came back in a place that was unfortunately not overly helpful. This is on me. I wasn't entirely sure what I was going to do. So in speaking with this member, this is probably the fourth call that we had, we were having this conversation and she had said, I have this dependent care account. Will this dependent care account by any chance cover any of these things? And I went, oh, you have a dependent care account, which means that your company, which wasn't through Nova, this particular benefit wasn't through Nova at the time, has some form of a tax favored fringe benefit, FSA, DCA, Sure. Clearly something along those lines. And so as we were talking, I said, our organization, I'm part of the organization as it relates to the reimbursement accounts. I know the things that can be approved with a letter of medical necessity. I know some other things that we can possibly do. Would you consider holding off? I mean, it's the fact that you probably don't have this money up front, but is this something you would consider is electing a certain dollar amount? I don't remember exactly what the max was at that time, but it was more than what the test had cost. It would have cost them. And as we were talking, she said, I really never thought that might be a possibility. And so she had said, let me talk to my employer, see if this is something that I can do, because she wasn't sure what the next year was going to look like, anything like that. So she ended up getting back to the employer, and I want to say within probably 3 hours, she had contacted me back and we had talked it through, saying, I can't guarantee what's going to happen because obviously I'm not reviewing the letter of medical necessity. I don't have the ability to say this is going to happen or not. But this is something you are going to take a chance at going into it, but it might be worth contacting the administrator of that particular benefit to see if they would be willing to take in a letter of medical necessity. and having a conversation about what you're trying to do. So as it turns out, she got the psychiatrist to fill out some information. She actually also put in a little bit in her letter, from what I gather. She read it to me over the phone. And it was as true as you can make it, with all heart and all concern and understanding about the desperation of what it takes for a parent to try to, make sure their kid's going to be taken care of one way or another. So she sent it in. It did take several weeks before she heard back, but they said that this would be something that they would approve. So open enrollment hits. She ultimately elects it. I don't hear from her for a while. And then within the first couple of days within the new year, because you get your full FSA allotment up front, your day $1, so to speak, she went and she ended up paying for that test. And they were able to, what ended up happening is she ended up getting a bill for it. She submitted the bill and they ended up getting reimbursed for it, which was great. Now, I don't know from that point forward, I don't know where she ultimately landed. Unfortunately, we kind of fell from that point forward. I got her past the finish line of getting this taken care of and funded.
Sure.
And we worked, the part of it was, as much as I wanted to beat the system, if you will, we were able to work within the system to remain compliant and to be able to get to a place where this person was able to get some hope at the end of the tunnel. And again, your child is, for most people, this is going to be something that is like, it's going to be do or die. I'll do what I have to take, whatever it takes. I'll do DoorDash. I'll do whatever I have to do. Right. They were in a situation where there was so much care needed. They didn't have the ability to pull up a second or a third job or do what they needed to do. And through the conversation, we were able to come up with something that it worked. It was able to get them to at least this next level. But unfortunately, like I said, we haven't really spoken since then. But I could understand why it can get weird.
Well, it's just it's intensely personal, vulnerable, intimate, all those things, and sounds like it was a long journey too. It sounds like there was a gap between the first diagnosis on this outdated or deprecated test that then had a new hoop to jump through, and as a parent that's had to jump through a hoop or two, like I can understand how that could be frustrating, forgetting any sort of awareness gap about how the system works. And so met with that first wall of, well, no, actually it's test and it requires X, Y, Z, and it costs ABC, and it won't be covered. Then it's like, I suppose, depending on the point in the year, it's like you feel like insanely stuck. And by the way, this condition's not changing, regardless of whether it's improving or worsening.
Absolutely,
it's there, and it's a big, it's a rock in your shoe. That's probably it's probably a lessening of it. I mean, it's serious. And the FSA is great too. As soon as you said that, I thought, okay, wow, that's nice, because, typically, at least as FSAs that I've had with, they're like use or lose dollars, right? So you must take advantage of them necessarily. And again, the fact that you get the day $1 is a nice way to pull that forward. I'm going to assume here, but I'm going to let you verify for me, that the member had no idea that was even a possibility.
None. Actually seemed incredibly shocked that might even have been a possibility. I will say this, though. I mean, and specifically tied to this, actually speaks to something that is sort of a drum I've been beating for years. I do feel the benefits of like the FSA, the DCA, even other elected accounts. People are so unfamiliar with it, and in this case, almost to a detriment. Like, this was something that, it's a tool that should be able to help you. It minimizes your gross income. You can use it for expenses that you typically have. Some employer groups allow a carryover from year to year, and you wouldn't know that if you're not engaged in the conversation, or the HR is not engaged in the conversation. And at that point, my eyes widened, because I had the platform to be able to talk about the benefit and explain what it could be. And then this particular enrollee had sought out, just was the recipient of the full benefit of what an FSA can do. So, and then they had, of course, whatever would happen in the future, but we walked through and what they would expect from a payroll perspective for the rest of the year. So they're kind of making small incremental payments on what they've used it for. They weren't going to use the entire amount, but they could use it for additional services. Like, we walked through this entire thing, and it was, For me, it was something at the time that it was a feather in my cap to bring forward. Even when I talk to my client services people or salespeople, these are the stories that we want to talk about the benefits and things that these FSAs and these DCAs can do,
For
amongst other
sure.
benefits that we have.
And the discussion of the benefit is something, and I've been to a couple different jobs in my career, and I've been given the brief on the first week of like, here's all the things that you get, but specifically those sorts of things, FSA, HSA, everything health related, has always, and I'm thinking about this, has really always been presented in terms of a cost against the top line, like here's what's going to get deducted out of your payroll. And with the FSA, there's always the appendix of like, oh, and by the way, you better use this or else like it's gone. And so it's like, oh,
That's
okay,
right.
well, is that just like income that I'm just never going to realize and never going to benefit from? And then there's the other side, of course, where I have things like HSAs, and then you're just like, well, you really should hold off on using those because,
Invest it.
increase the value. And it's like, okay, well, then what have I done here? And so when something like this happens, where obviously you would use some of those funds, if you don't know it up front, or it's presented in terms of a cost that you don't know you're going to need, you might just elect not to have it, like it sounds like this member didn't do, out of complete ignorance, not knowing, right? Not
Absolutely.
out of like, but there are cases in which it could be done out of like a cost avoidance. And that's too bad. Now, let me ask you this, because obviously there was a lot of education involved here in making this member aware that they even had this type of a benefit or how to take advantage of it. But you also noted that this was outside of your direct remit at that time, that you learned just as they did that they had this sort of account. I think that is emblematic to the Care Beyond Code theme, by the way, because that was you going above and beyond, like that was, which you could see. But it makes me wonder how that general education or the closing of an awareness gap has since influenced the way that you work with various members, or how is that instilled as a practice at Nova? Because this sounds like, and if anybody's listening to this or is nodding along because like they've had a case like this, you'll know that there's an awareness gap out there. How did that funnel back into the way that you administrate?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have a pretty large portfolio as it relates to groups that we have, and I started in this line of business, embarrassingly so, like 2 decades ago, and I did notice this gap early on, but it was something that we continually, we strive to do a little bit better at. And again, it's difficult if you have 700-800 different clients and trying to get in their ears, but. And we've done some articles, we've done some brochures, but internally we've had these conversations with our client services folks, talking about sort of where the performance is as it relates to each individual group. And it's not unlike us to see maybe an 8 to 10% participation overall as part of the entire employee base. And that's it. So when we want to try to grow organically, we realize that some of the reasons why people don't do that or why they don't participate is an education piece. So as part of the overall renewal, we do offer education. We always offer some performance related metrics as it relates to how each group performs overall, and talk about how they can get more people organically into the plan, including some of the overall, obviously, wage benefits, but as it relates to planning out what you think you're going to ultimately use for the year as far as medical expenses per person or per family. And I am speaking specifically to the FSA, but there's other accounts as well, like Deer Transit and Parking, Dependent Care, Adoption, there's all of these things that we put out there. And we even have wellness benefits for that matter, and these are all pieces that we try to advertise, educate, and we have face-to-face conversation whenever possible. So this is not something that we're resting on our laurels either. We are trying to progress in this because we feel like it's a heavily underutilized benefit. And I think most people that administer these benefits would probably say the same thing. We are definitely not trying to be a set it and forget it organization. We want to be engaged in the development of new plans and designs and things that are going to benefit the entire population.
And all the way down to benefiting an individual member, like in this case, it sounds like you did a bang up
100%.
job of that. I keep coming back to this theme, and I'm learning a lot more about this industry too as I have these in-depth conversations as we build this catalog of stories, which we really didn't see in the market, and now we're grateful to be doing so, which is how do we reframe this particular corner of the world from something which is seen as like an overburden and I got to go through this and it's a cost center at time suck, all that, into like, no, otherwise like you wouldn't have had these opportunities. This is a benefit center as opposed to a cost center. And this is exactly the type of story that we're looking for. Now, I know that you had finished there by saying that you haven't been in contact with this member since the time that you arranged that. I'm going to hope that no news is good news in that way, that something was either determined or the care was properly applied going forward, things like that. So I'm just curious as we begin to round out here, the ways that these stories and others have influenced your style at Nova and the way that you would advise others, perhaps people who are at the beginning of those 2 decades of their career, to come up in here. And the answer here could be as simple as ask more questions, but I'm curious as to 1 or 2 of your, I don't want to say secret sauces, but top tips on how to truly instill care beyond whatever code exists wherever you are.
Yeah. So for my call centers, and I think this is no secret, in my call centers rather, we've had this conversation multiple times, whether it's in meetings. I have a servant leadership posture. That's how I try to serve the people that work for me. I ask my managers to do the same thing for the people that work for them. And I've been very upfront with the customer service team that that's what we're looking for. And we like to say, because we are, although we're national, we want to say that we are regional also. And these are our neighbors, and these are who you should be thinking about when, they're at parties and people say, who do you work for? And they ask you a ton of different questions about their healthcare, because people cannot navigate through a healthcare. So I ask them to ask questions, put yourself in their shoes. That is one of the bigger things that we promote is put yourself in their shoes. In my circumstance, it was very easy to put myself into this member's shoes because, I was living a very early stage of that, but it touched my heart, and I just felt the desperation to feel like no one's willing to help. No one's willing to jump in. And I hear that many times on calls, because I do review calls on a regular basis to hear how things are going. And I will say, and I'm proud to say, we get at least 2 accolades by members and or providers a week. And in a healthcare call center, that's pretty much unheard of. And I share that.
Fairly uncommon, yeah.
Uncommon. Like it just doesn't happen. And good for those who do, but we get those at least 2 a week. I forward those over to our client services and our sales folks. So when they have conversation with the group, to show that, we're doing something really important here. When we're looking and seeking for purpose, you are currently customer service care navigator. You're in a job that has purpose. And that's what we try to convey.
Well, I'm glad that you were in that particular circumstance at that time to help that member. I'm glad that you've continued to instill that level of care at Nova, and for coming on briefly here and sharing the story. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
And for everybody who has tuned in thus far, again, you've heard a plethora of stories, whether they be simple or serious. Just so you know, this is what we do all day at VBA. We help administrators make processes more efficient. Our mission is to make the healthcare experience better for everybody. That's what we're trying to do via telling these stories. And if that's of interest to you, check us out. And that's pretty much it. Otherwise, we will see you the next time on Care Beyond Code.